If you have the question, can I recover money damages for emotional injuries in a personal injury case? The short answer is yes, but there's 5 things that you need to know about recovering money damages for emotional injuries in a personal injury claim. So let's jump right in. The first thing to understand is yes, you can recover money for emotional injuries in a personal injury case. To begin with, the law recognizes that a person who has been injured is allowed to recover for both their physical injuries and for their emotional injuries. Those emotional injuries might be called emotional distress or mental anguish, but those can cover a variety of different things. You can have some kind of garden variety emotional distress damages, such as some basic anxiety, some slight depression, fear, anger, those types of emotional reactions that you can expect to happen after a traumatic incident. But emotional injuries can be far greater than that and can include things such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or other types of more entrenched and debilitating psychological injuries that can happen when a traumatic event occurs. Established medical literature shows that a traumatic event can cause a variety of very serious psychological problems, and those are the types of mental anguish and emotional distress that can be recoverable in a personal injury action, along with the more garden variety things that I mentioned before. A second thing to understand about recovering money for emotional injuries is that many people who have emotional injuries following a traumatic event have a history of emotional conditions from before the event. So there's no question that we live in a very, very stressful world, and a lot of times some terrible things happen to us that are outside of our control. Those are things that can happen to us when we're children or various events throughout life, and those can take an emotional toll on us. Oftentimes, people will get medical treatment either through counseling or medication or other different types of therapy where they're dealing with these emotional conditions. And what's good is that most people learn how to deal with those things. They learn how to cope with it, they are able to get through life, and they're able to manage all of life's stresses. But then trauma can occur, and that can cause the life that is being held together to completely unravel and fall apart. And while an injured party cannot recover for the underlying conditions that existed, they can recover for that increased emotional damage that they have experienced. And because of that, the event could ultimately cause a much greater harm to them than would otherwise occur to someone who didn't have those underlying emotional conditions. A third thing to understand about recovering money for emotional damages is that sometimes emotional harms could be a bigger deal than physical harms. So for instance, we see these horrifically violent crashes where the vehicles are mangled, and miraculously, the occupants of the car are able to walk away from that vehicle, and they seem to have only minor injuries. But where that does occur, they may have emotional injuries that are far greater than those physical injuries. Those people may experience just a complete fear of driving or getting in a vehicle. They may now be in a position where their stress response to various stimuli is completely out of whack. And now they're in a position where they're unable to function as they had before. So it's possible that a crash may shake someone to their core emotionally in their nervous system, even though physically they're able to manage through life. A fourth thing to understand about recovering money for emotional injuries is that juries really can understand emotional injuries. So every time we do a jury trial, we get to ask questions of the jury in what's called the jury selection phase. There's always at least one person who will say that they had an extremely strong emotional reaction to some traumatic event that had occurred. They may have seen someone who they're very close to experience what a lot of people would call a nervous breakdown. And that could be where there's an emotional response that is so strong where the person's faculties are completely overwhelmed and they're unable to deal with life and the stressors that come with it. I think that a lot of jurors could understand emotional injuries also after COVID. You know, when we had COVID with the pandemic and the lockdowns that occurred, there was just intense loneliness and sadness and anxiety and grief that a lot of people were feeling. And I think having that understanding makes jurors more empathetic, which makes them more willing to award reasonable damages for someone who has experienced these types of harms. A fifth thing to understand if you're seeking compensation for emotional injuries in a personal injury lawsuit is that insurance companies tend to be very, very skeptical in terms of awarding money for emotional injuries. Most states will say that you can't recover if the only thing you suffer is emotional injuries. They'll say that you have to suffer some sort of physical injury in addition. Insurance companies can generally deal with physical injuries. So for example, if there's a broken bone, you can just show them an x-ray, but you can't show an x-ray for an emotional injury. So insurance companies tend to be very, very skeptical when they hear that somebody is having disabling emotional injuries as a result of some traumatic event. Because of that skepticism, you can expect that the case is most likely not going to resolve for true value in pre-litigation. You're probably going to have to file suit, go through discovery, do a deposition, possibly even go all the way through trial if what you're trying to do is recover significant damages for emotional distress. So if you do have a case where emotional damages make up a large component of the claim, you have to be willing to fight, you need to be prepared to fight, and you have to be willing to go all the way through trial if necessary. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you haven't yet, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel, and please stay tuned for more videos. Thanks.